We're going to call to order the Board of Selectmen meeting, Town of Hingham, for January 10th, 2019. At this time, I'd invite the fellow committees that are meeting with us in joint session to call themselves to order.
Call to order the January 10th, 2019 meeting of the Water Company Acquisition Study Committee.
I call to order the January 10th, 2019 meeting of the Advisory Committee.
Call to order the January 10th, 2019 meeting of the Subcommittee for the Water Company of the Advisory Committee.
Okay. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. All right. Tonight, the much-anticipated, long-awaited meeting that we have been talking about with respect to a independent review is going to occur. If I might be so bold, I'm going to suggest that it's going to go as follows. Mr. Mayor will make some introductory remarks. The experts that the town has retained will give us presentations. We'll have an opportunity to ask questions. We will open it up to the public to pose questions. And to the extent you wish to speak, please raise your hand. I'll call upon you. Come to the microphone. Identify yourself by name and address address the questions to the chair, me. And at that point, we'll endeavor to answer the question as best that we can with the appropriate individual. So with that in mind, I know there's a full crowd here. The meeting could go on for a while. If you want to speak, I'm going to try and make sure that everybody who wants to gets that opportunity. If we're replowing the same ground, I would politely remind you of that, but at this point, that's how the evening's going to go. All right. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate the interest you've shown in this issue. Thomas, where are you?
Right over here. It's changed sides.
All right.
No offense, Karen.
I'm used to seeing you on the,
That's right.
the left.
Okay, so as you just heard from everyone who called their boards to order, tonight is a joint meeting. We're discussing the third party's review of our financial model. This is a meeting of the Board of Selectmen, the Water Company Acquisition Study Committee, the Advisory Committee, and the Subcommittee on Water Company Acquisition of the Advisory Committee. If you'll remember, back on October 9th, the Board of Selectmen asked me to engage a third-party review with respect to the purchase of the water company. I have done that. I reached out to several firms throughout the months of October and through November, and landed on two firms that would be able to help us with different expertise. So tonight we have Julie Keim, who's a principal with Berry Dunn out of Maine, and Jim Dondero, who is a managing partner with Anderson Tax out of Boston. I will let both of them and ask both of them when they give their presentations to speak to their expertise, so you all get to know who they are and what their firms are experts in. So instead of doubling that, I will ask them to do that for themselves. So that's what I have, Mr. Chair. I would suggest that we ask Ms. Keim from Berry Dunn to start us off.
Have the floor.
Okay. Good evening. As Tom mentioned, my name is Julie Keim. I'm a principal at Berry Dunn. It's a CPA and consulting firm. It's primarily based out of Portland, Maine, but we also have offices in Bangor, Maine, Manchester, New Hampshire, a small office in Glastonbury, Connecticut, and we also have offices in West Virginia and Charleston, as well as Phoenix, Arizona. So as you can see that we are a mid-sized firm, and we do have specialties in each of our areas. And so I lead our telecom and energy practice, which is the practice that relates to highly rate-regulated environments. That includes telephone companies, electric companies, water companies, any other public utility that would fall under the rate setting and rate of return mechanisms. And so I've just put a quick map up there. I'll have other information available if you'd like to see a little bit more. But really what I focus on and what my team focuses on relates to, as I mentioned, primarily telecom, energy, and water public utilities. And I do a lot of financial statement audit work, as well as projections and financial modeling. However, in this particular instance, I was specifically asked to look at some of the very rate-driven rate-setting mechanisms and questions that came out through this process of looking at the model. And my understanding is Jim will speak more to the model itself. We have a deep bench of staff that work on these rate-regulated utilities, primarily who worked with me this year was John Robertson on this particular engagement, excuse me, and he has he worked in the rate-regulated environment in a telephone company as a controller and accounting manager for a number of years in the 90s, and then came to Barry Dunn and brought his expertise in that industry and cross-practiced it throughout our electric and public utility sector as well. And he's been with the firm for over 20 years. He's been there almost as long as I have. He was not able to join us this evening, but he was an integral part to this process. We're members of many organizations, primarily the Northeast Public Power Association, Maine Energy Marketers Association, as well as some other telecom, again, more rate-regulated type of entities. And I currently chair a group called the Telergy Alliance, which is primarily focused a lot on rural telephone companies and their situations, but we have subcommittees within that alliance. It's 6 CPA firms that are unrelated, that are throughout the country. So as far as California, we've got St. Louis, we've got Nashville, it's throughout the country, and we really use each other as resources when we have questions that we haven't seen or haven't come up before. So I feel like we have a really good network and resource to really be able to provide the public utility sector with the best assistance. I do work with for-profit entities, so I work with investor-owned utilities, as well as working for the nonprofit, so cooperatives and municipalities. So I understand both sides of how rate setting can work and how different it is between a for-profit and a nonprofit, if you will. So it's bridging that gap. So hopefully my presentation and my comments will show that, and if there are any other questions that come up, I'm happy to take those. I believe they're going to be at the end. So that's a little bit about Barry Dunn, a little bit about myself and John Robertson, who was my primary team member that worked on this particular project. So I'm going to skip back. It's really hard to read, and I apologize for that, but I'm really going to talk about it, so I think talking is more important than reading the particular words at this point, because it'll give you an opportunity to hear what I have to say and be able to ask the questions that you might have post my presentation and Jim's presentation. As Tom mentioned, I was contacted to be able to provide kind of an independent analysis, basically questioning, commenting, adding possibly recommendations or changes to the existing model that the town is using in assessing whether it is a good fit for the town to acquire the water company. And so I was specifically asked to comment on 5 particular assumptions that we use in the model, and that's what my presentation is about, and that's where I spent my time on. So I'm just going to go over those 5 assumptions real quick, and then I will go into each individual one in a little bit more detail and tell you about how we approached it and either findings, recommendations, or conclusions that we reached on each of those. So the 5 assumptions were so I'm going to go back far enough. The most important part, I think, is the starting point. So one of the key assumptions really is the number. The starting with the correct revenue requirement that had been approved by the DPU under Aquarion's rate case. So that was one piece that we want to make sure. They wanted to make sure that was they were using the correct number, the most recent filings, and the most recent information available at the time of my review. So we looked at that. The town also used an assumption of a 3-year frequency of rate cases and asked us to comment on whether that was a reasonable amount of time between rate cases, too long, too short, or about the right time. The third assumption was related to the fact that they used a 10% increase in revenue requirement between those rate cases. So, for instance, they used 10% every 3 years. And their question was, is that a reasonable increase in rates based on what we've seen in the industry and our expertise, as well as what has happened and what Aquarion has done, not only in Massachusetts, but maybe related to some of their other entities that they own. The most time that I'll probably spend talking today relates to the mains replacement adjustment mechanism, or MRAM. And that's really, I think, a source of maybe some confusion. It's a little bit different. It's a very specific carve-out. So we looked at the order, we looked at the explanation that was provided by the DPU, and we looked at how the town applied those assumptions related to the MRAM surcharge. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Actually, that's where most of my time will be spent. And then the fifth assumption was really related to whether this MRAM, this additional surcharge, would that continue post this rate case? Meaning, is that something that would continue on past this particular rate case, the rate case 1790 is I'm referring to. So as I mentioned before, those were the 5 key assumptions that we looked at and what we focused on. There may have been other assumptions that you might have identified that you might have questions on, or others might have questions on, and you can post those to Tom, but at this point, those are the 5 that I and my firm have commented on. So, I'm not, are you taking questions, or?
No.
Okay.
Time as well.
Okay.
Proceed.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just start, again, as I mentioned, I'm going to go through each assumption individually. So the first assumption related to the initial revenue requirement that was included in the DPU Order 1790 that was approved. And per the November 29th, 2018 compliance filing, that revenue requirement was set at $13,047,168, and we were able to tie that directly into the order and the compliance filing with no variances. So that was kind of an easy task for us to do, but as I mentioned at the beginning, I think it's one of the most important places to start, because you need to start in the most recent information and the most recent place from the order. The next assumption related to the town's model uses a 3-year, every 3 years initiating a rate case. And so as we looked at that, and we had discussions with the town and looked at the rate cases that have been filed most recently by Aquarion, they noted in their Order 1143 that as a matter of policy, new rates would be filed every 3 years. So that was a statement that was made by Aquarion, that was their intent. So I could see 3 years being a reasonable time frame to enter into a rate case every 3 years, excuse me. However, as I mentioned to the town and in my report, in the order, in the most recent order, so the 1790 order, it alludes to, in a lot of places, 5 years. So this MRAM mechanism, as we're going to speak about here in a few minutes, it was driven off of a 5-year recovery period. The rate case expenses related to Aquarion's rate case was also being recovered over a 5-year period. So I suggested that possibly, at least in the initial modeling, a 5-year period might be more appropriate. However, I don't believe that a 3-year rate case would be an unreasonable assumption. So as most of you that have been involved know, rate cases come up as costs increase, and you need to go in for higher rates, or if there's a significant event in the opposite that would decrease the rates, then they would go in for that as well. So it's very subjective, but those were the 2 key points that we identified through our review. As I mentioned, the 3 years that was noted in an earlier order, stated by Aquarion that that's a policy. We also did notice that that in Connecticut, Aquarion has been going in typically every 3 years, so it's not an unreasonable assumption, but in this instance, a 5-year period might be more appropriate just based on the mechanism we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. Either way, I believe it would be a reasonable assessment. And that kind of dovetails into assumption number 3 when we talk about the rate increases that was used. The assumption was a 10% rate increase related to the previous rate case amount. So just to kind of jump backwards a little bit, if you were going to use a 5-year period, that increase in revenue requirement would then also increase more so than if it was just every 3 years. And I'll go into that here now. Basically, what we used in assessing whether a 10% rate of revenue increase would be reasonable every 3 years is we looked back at Aquarion's rate increases that they had filed, and we used their Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire companies and kind of looked at them, even though I know they're all different. They're all, managed somewhat similarly. So we used those just kind of as a base point to see if Massachusetts was looking out of the norm compared to the other 2 states or not. And in doing so, we noticed that the average annual rate increases for each of those 3 states ranged from 3.74%, again, this is an annual average, to as high as 5.25% in some instances. So, and that was in New Hampshire. But we used that as a baseline to see if a 10% increase in rates would be reasonable. If you annualize those increases over the 3-year period, again, if we're just looking at the 3 years, which is what the town has currently used in their model, the rates could increase, the revenue requirement could increase anywhere from 11% to 16%. However, the town chose to use 10%, and their question to us was that a reasonable rate to use? It's somewhat of an oversimplified method because nothing is static or perfect, but in using history and using the information that's available, in looking at what has happened in this particular state as well as the other states, using a 10% increase in the 3-year period seemed reasonable and on the lower end of what had actually taken place over the last number of rate cases throughout New England, in the New England states. And as I mentioned before, if they were to change that, the first rate case out to a 5-year period as opposed to a 3-year period, then you could argue, or they could argue, that that rate increase in that first period, that 5 years out, would be more in the neighborhood of 16+% because you'd be adding 2 more years of, an annual average of around 3.3%. So based on that information, we believe that a 10% increase for this particular modeling and this analysis would be reasonable. So as I mentioned at the outset of my presentation, I think where most of our time was really spent was looking at this MRAM, this additional surcharge. And there was a lot of information in detail in the DPU order, as well as information that was provided by Aquarion in their compliance filings. So we had a lot of information to use that was publicly available and gave us really good information about what we think buried on, we as the experts in looking at rate setting, how we think it should be applied through this model. So without going through machination of numbers, which I believe Jim may be doing some of that, and overall, the town used the base revenue that we talked about earlier, which was the number one assumption, was the $13 million that was included in the order. And they used that to apply this MRAM factor to it. And in the order, there was a few items that were specifically carved out that would be reduced from that base revenue, because there's a cap again on the MRAM surcharge through the order, that they had to take out some miscellaneous charges and some purchased water surcharges, and then it was adjusted by the Hingham Water Treatment Plant. Which was the most significant reduction in calculating, again, we're just talking about the MRAM cap. And in doing so, the town used the appropriate numbers. They agreed out to the most recent filing that was in November by Aquarion. So the starting point, again, was correct, and as of the most recent information at the time of our work. Some of the findings that we had, or questions or comments that we had related to how the town applied the MRAM surcharge was, the MRAM was, and I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but the MRAM factor, this extra surcharge, was capped at 2% of the prior year's base revenues, again, adjusted for those items that I just mentioned, and so it's capped at 2% per year, or 10% over the 5-year period. Now, this 2% is only allowable if Aquarion actually expends the capital expenditures, which are they're considered MRAM eligible additions, and again, they're specifically carved out in the order, and Aquarion is required to file the necessary information to make sure that the assets that they're including in this calculation are eligible. In this model, they're assuming that Aquarion will do that and that they will be approved. So we're looking at the 2% cap annually. That 2%, the 2% cap was applied appropriately in each of the 5 years, the first 5 years, as we discussed, that it was allowed. In their model, the town included some additional amounts that they considered unrecovered during that time frame. One of the comments that we had related to that was that this MRAM surcharge is only approved for a 5-year period, and that at the end of that 5-year period, this surcharge would be reset back to zero, and the eligible additions would then be included in the rate base or the rate case and in the traditional rate setting mechanism process. So by including a couple extra years, the concern would be, again, in a simplified method, would be that there could be a possible of duplicate or double recovery. So we've suggested, and again, it's not a significant amount as $174,000 a year for 2.5 years after the 5-year period. So it's not a significant amount. However, once you compound that, our suggestion would be just to remove that, and that way it takes out any concern about the duplicate recovery. The town also included at each rate case assumption, again, in the model that we reviewed was every 3 years. They included those eligible MRAM additions in the rate base in the next rate case, which is appropriate and should take place. They used the correct numbers. They came directly from the Aquarion filing, and again, I have it referenced in my report as Exhibit AG 1314, and those numbers come directly from there, and they agree to those. So they're using the correct amounts in those subsequent rate cases. But again, as I mentioned before, in just those couple years post the 5-year period, there was some concern from our perspective that there could be some duplicate recovery, although probably not significant, hard to say without rerunning all those numbers, and that wasn't part of what we were doing. We were pointing out just some questions, comments, and recommendations. So related to those eligible MRAM additions, one of the other items that we suggested modifying the model was related to, as those eligible additions go into the rate case, into the rate base, the earning of the company, they would then depreciate over a period of time. And so we recommended reducing that effect on revenue requirement for including those eligible additions in there. One of the other items that we identified and recommended was that based on the rate case back to the 10%, is that they used the 10%, which included the MRAM increase, the surcharge related to the MRAM investments, and it really should just be on just the revenue requirement, because again, when the company goes in for a rate case, those go into the eligible investments, and therefore they would be calculated at that point. So by including them both, again, you could be potentially doubling or over-recovering for those. One of the other questions related to MRAM was what happens after what happens at the next rate case? Would you ask, from what we've seen, would the MRAM continue? Would the surcharge on customers' bills continue? And obviously, it's difficult to tell what might happen in the future. It was clear in the DPU order that they said it would reset to zero at the next rate case. However, they would discuss, and this is the DPU, would discuss including an MRAM or some kind of a recovery mechanism in future rate cases. So the door is certainly left open to those particular surcharges, and these surcharges really relate to investments that are above and beyond your typical investments, your repairs. It's really when you're replacing significant amounts or you're trying to really improve the infrastructure of the system, and so these aren't your typical, typical capital expenditures that you would see on an annual basis. And that's when the DPU and companies go in and they look for, like, this is a very specific item. It hasn't happened as of the rate case. We think it's going to. We need some kind of recovery, or else we're not going to be able to afford to, do all these improvements or, increase the productivity of the infrastructure. So although it's hard to say, the DPU has certainly left it open, and we have seen, in specific as it relates to Aquarion, they have in other states had similar mechanisms. They're not the same. In Massachusetts, it's actually a little more detailed, it appears, from what I've seen from, again, publicly available documents. Massachusetts has actually limited and capped it out at a lower level than maybe some of the other states are, but they are requesting it in other states, and they have been continuing to get those additional surcharges added to their rate cases in the future. So it would not be unreasonable to think that that would be the case. However, that is a DPU decision on whether they believe the information that's available at the next rate case would significantly improve and enhance the system. So those were the 5 particular assumptions that we were asked to look at, and hopefully I've hit on all of the pieces that we went through in the process. But then I obviously will be here for questions at the end.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen and citizens of the town, if you're watching this on cable, I apologize for the quality of the sound. We recently executed a contract to improve the sound equipment, but that's a work in progress, so appreciate your forbearance. At this time, I turn to my colleagues, to my left and to my right. Do we have any questions that we'd like to pose?
You may want to consider hearing Jim's presentation first, so that you get the entire picture. It might answer some of the questions you otherwise might end up with.
Good suggestion.
Okay.
You have the floor.
Oh, sorry.
Can you,
Yep.
It's the next.
Sorry. I got talking and
so,
forgot my responsibility.
good evening. My name is Jim Dondero. I'm with Anderson Tax. A little bit about our firm. Anderson Tax was founded in 2002 in the ashes of Arthur Anderson. And it currently we have about 4,000 people worldwide, about 500 partners, and 122 offices. In the U.S., we have about 100 partners, about 1,000 people in 19 cities. We've been in Boston since '02 as a practice. I lead the valuation practice in Boston. I have over 30 years' experience doing financial modeling and general business consulting. I work with both private, small and large, and many public companies in a variety of industries. Particularly because of the public companies, our work is routinely reviewed by the Big Four accounting firms, by the SEC, by the IRS in relation to tax matters. So, we have a history of having our work scrutinized and reviewed consistently and on a regular basis. The type of projects we do are a lot of financial reporting related valuation, related to acquisitions, tax valuations, strategic planning exercises, straight financial modeling for clients who might need assistance, and a lot of acquisition analysis. Before joining Anderson, I worked at a number of firms, and in my background, I have an undergraduate degree in accounting from Michigan State and a master's from the Sloan School at MIT. So I just want to talk about what I was asked to do. The scope of the project that the town asked for was for us to review and confirm the town's financial analysis to see if it was consistent with, the facts were consistent with the DPU rate case filings, and if the inclusion of where the other costs came from in the exercise, or were they all there to represent municipal ownership. In addition, we were asked to assess the reasonableness of the assumptions used in the town model, and to the extent we felt the assumptions weren't reasonable, to make any recommendations. Likewise, we were asked to do the same thing for the Aquarion model, and to identify any changes that we thought necessary. So what we ultimately did was we built our own set of the town's model and the Aquarion model, but using assumptions that we were comfortable with. And I think that's, I want to just clarify, you're going to see some numbers here, there might be some differences. We went back and used the numbers, the models that were on the town website, because that's what people have seen. The differences between those models are the numbers that you've read about and you've seen and you've heard discussed. So we wanted to take that as a starting point. So as such, I do not have NRAM in this analysis at all. Now, the impact of not including it is primarily to the Aquarion model, and it would increase the rates on the Aquarion side to some extent. So that's not in the analysis we did. Again, I was trying to make it reasonably transparent so people could look at what they've already seen and be able to bridge what they've seen to what I will describe to you. So I'm going to make a few background comments. The first one, and again, this was based on some information I had seen. I think it's really important that everyone realize that typically municipal water companies are included in enterprise funds, right? So as such, they do not affect the town's tax rates. It's all about the users of the enterprise fund paying user fees, i.e. water bills, to fund it. Secondly, the costs are going to be what they're going to be. The inflation rate going into the future is going to be the same for whether it's privately owned or whether it's publicly owned, because at the end of the day, this exercise is really about which ownership option is the best option for the town of Hingham, for the ratepayers. And so that's really key. It has to be an apples to apples comparison. Rather than focusing on is one inflation rate more likely than another inflation rate, they should just be the same between these two models, so you can look at what it is, the distinction you should be focused on, which is ownership structure. And then lastly, and I think Julie kind of alluded to this as well, are historical measurements are a really good indication of future performance, what the future is going to look like. I mean, who knows? But certainly looking at past performance and past practice is a reasonable place to start. And then just a couple more, municipal ownership. Municipal ownership does eliminate some costs. That's just a fact. Municipal entities do not pay income taxes. Municipal entities do not have to earn a return on the assets. And municipal entities do not have rate filing costs because they set their own rates. So you can debate the extent of those cost eliminations, but those are real in municipal ownerships. Municipal entities may have higher wage costs due to prevailing wage laws. This is a very contested area. You can find people who will say that the difference between public contracts and private contracts is significant. You will also find people who will say that those studies are flawed because they don't consider the specific characteristics of public contracts that might have other requirements. For example, in a public building, you might have greater ADA compliance issues than you would in some private settings. So my own read of the research, and I am not a prevailing wage expert, so I will say that up front, is that while the impact it's not clear, I think it's likely not to be material. You're only talking about an impact on the wage component of your costs of construction, not on the equipment, the materials, all those other factors, if indeed it is material. And then the last one, and this is also factual, is municipal entities have lower borrowing costs. And they're significantly lower borrowing costs. So I say that sort of as general background, and then what I want to do here is I want to go through the town's assumptions for what Aquarion's model would look, what it looks like under Aquarion ownership. Aquarion's assumptions for Aquarion's model, the town's assumptions for the town's ownership, and then I'll talk about what we're proposing. So again, Julie touched on some of this, so I won't belabor it, but the town's assumptions, actually, Julie didn't touch on these. She talked about the town's rates. So the town's assumptions of Aquarion rates was top-down. Actually, you did. And what I mean by that is they looked at the overall historical rates and historical rate increases for Aquarion, and from that, they projected what the rates would be. So what revenue would be. They didn't dig into the underlying cost structure in the model that's on the website. They just looked at it from, here's what type of rates were paid in the past, here's what you can expect in the future. And, you know, that's reasonable. They assume a 10% increase every 3 years. If you look at that from the standpoint of a compound annual growth rate, or we call a CAGR, that gives you a 3.2% increase on a compounded basis. My calculations of those same numbers based on the Mass, Connecticut, and New Hampshire numbers are different from what you see in Julie's report. I believe it's because
Use a longer period.
well, you also had worm in there or not? But when they had,
No, we took that out.
you took it out, okay. So that we have different periods, but the numbers are order of magnitude similar. And what they all point to is that a rate increase assumption of 10% is not outrageous. It's a reasonable way to look at it. And you have a decade of rate history to suggest that that is a reasonable rate. So that's how the town did it. And they came up with a pretty large number, and a number that was very different from Aquarion. So what did Aquarion do? So Aquarion model is a bottoms up. It looks at their costs and what they need to get for a return and projects out those costs, and from that derives the rates. And so the question is, where did those costs come from? The initial starting point is the DPU rate case. I don't think there's any dispute on that, that $13,047,000 that was approved that Julie had up earlier. However, in their analysis, they use inflation to grow all their costs with the exception of a few things. Depreciation is not going up with the rate of inflation. It's based on how much money they spend, makes sense. The cost of debt is not tied to inflation. The cost of equity, the profit that they earn, is not tied to inflation. And the water treatment plant lease costs aren't directly tied to inflation. They're based on the lease agreement. So other than those, all the other operating costs and payroll taxes and property taxes are all indexed to their inflation assumption. And their inflation assumption is 2.2%. Now, that inflation assumption is consistent with what you will find in the source that they cite for a 10-year forecast of inflation. But they're applying it in a 30-year model. So, is it reasonable? Again, I can tell you it's different from the towns, and so in the spirit of sort of apples to apples, I think the bigger issue is sort of alignment more than who's right at predicting what it's going to be over 30 years. Their depreciation assumption is based on $2 million per year of capital expenditures, 35-year life. No increase is built into that capital expenditures. For 30 years, no inflation increase at all.
Can you say that again? Can you repeat that? I didn't get it.
So the depreciation assumption,
Yep.
it's based on the base that they have today, and then they're increasing it. I believe in 2019, they're assuming a $5 million capital expenditure, and then beyond that, they're assuming $2 million per year, no adjustment for inflation, okay? And this is all important because depreciation is an expense. Your rates are set on their expenses, right? They have a bunch of capital and they have a bunch of expenses, all utilities do, and your rates are based on them getting back their costs, recovering their costs, and them getting a profit on their capital or being able to pay the interest expense on their capital, whether it's their debt or equity. So the other thing I noticed was that the asset balance declined over time, and I'm not going to get into the details, but it struck me that they have an error in the way they were calculating their depreciation that caused that number to go down, that asset base to decline over time. And then the one other point here on this page is the debt cost assumption they use. They assume that they're going to be able to borrow at the town's rate of 3.75. Now, Moody currently gives them a rating at Baa2. And I looked on Standard & Poor's, slightly different credit rating classification, but basically for that level of credit, I'm coming up with a 10-year interest cost today of about 4.88, not 3.75. So there is a spread there that has to be looked at, and that 3.75 is also over a 30-year period. Some additional points on Aquarion. That use of a lower interest rate applied to the declining asset balance lowers their debt cost projections. Now, remember, lower cost means lower rate increases, right? So in terms of comparison, you may think about lower costs, they're not overinflating things, but in fact, what they're doing is they're suggesting lower rate increases. The water treatment plant percentage rent payment is held constant, even though the lease agreement has that increasing over time. And there's an adjustment factor which was only applied in the first year of the model. So there's a concern there. The equity costs they use is 10.5%. I recalculated it myself, looking at a bunch of public utilities, and came up with a cost of equity of the exact same number. So I have no issue with the 10.5%. However, they use that number to get a return on their part of their base, the assets that they're holding. And as I said, that asset base is declining in the outer years, and so it's sort of understating what that return on equity should be. And then finally, and this is a really major assumption, they assume that the Department of Public Utilities is only going to give them 75% of the rate requests. The most recent one was 99%. They got 99% of the costs is being recovered. So, 75%, all honesty, you have to remember the Department of Public Utilities' role is it's to regulate public utilities, but it's also to ensure that they're financially healthy and are able to do their job. So over time, I'm not sure it's a valid assumption to assume they would always shortchange the request by 25%. So my conclusion is that many of Aquarion's assumptions, I have no problem with a bottom-up approach. I think that's, if you have the details, it's a fine way to do it, but many of their assumptions are biased towards yielding a lower rate increase over time. So now let me switch gears a bit, and I'll come back to the Aquarion model and what we were thinking for that. But let me talk about the town's assumptions for the town's rates. Because the town's model for what the town ownership would look like is based on a bottom-up approach, very similar to what Aquarion did. Their biggest number are the operating costs of the system, and it's based on third-party quotes for running the system. And my understanding is there were 2 quotes that were received, and the number I was given represented the higher of those 2 quotes. So, it's third-party, someone who's interested in operating the system. I am not an expert in water system operations, so having 2 independent parties come up with numbers and using the higher one, I think is a very strong approach. There are some additional operating costs that were estimated based on discussions the team did talking to other water systems, and they seem to have taken a relatively conservative approach to trying to load in incremental costs that would result from town ownership. All their inflation assumption is 3%, not 2.2. Their debt service is the 3.75 borrowing rate. That came from bond counsel, so I believe that's a solid number. 29-year debt and level payments. Their CapEx it's the same numbers that Aquarion used. It's $5 million in year 1 and then $2 million beyond that. But they had a 5% increase every 3 years. And the CapEx funding for all that CapEx is going to be funded over 20 years using a 3.5% borrowing rate. And And that actually, in the original model, did not increase the 25 basis points, but that's what we're going to be doing. So my conclusion is, I think the operating cost being from a credible third party makes it fairly solid. I think the financing assumptions appear reasonable with the addition of the 25 basis point increase over time. And the Aquarion, in their comparison of rates, actually used the town model. So I don't have, the town took a stab at developing Aquarion's costs. Aquarion just used what the town had calculated. So we don't have to put you through this for that one. So here's what it looks like. Here's what some of the numbers. The operating costs, which most costs are increased with inflation. I mentioned the few that aren't, the treatment plant lease, financing, the costs and the depreciation costs are not. Town used 3%, Aquarion used 2.2%. I opted to use 3%. Again, you could run this with 2.2. The fact is, remember, we're trying to compare these two, so they're going to have the same inflation rate, right, no matter who owns it. Capital expenditure and cost increases. The town had 2.2 million, 5 million in the first year. Aquarion had 2 million, 5 million in the first year. So those assumptions were the same. Aquarion had a plan that was presented on August 13th, and that had a specific capital expenditure plan. I used the numbers from that plan through 2022. I averaged, they had specific numbers for each year. I happened to average 19, 20, and 21, and then I averaged 21, 22, 19, 20, and 21. I averaged 20, 21, and 22 to get my number for 22 going forward. So what I used was 2.7 million for 3 years, and then 2.5 million after that. And I increased those costs by 5% every 3 years. So you're going to see differences when you look at all the models. Part of it is that I just have more money being spent replacing pipes in the ground and all the rest of it. But again, presumably both parties should be doing those improvements to the system. And to not use those same ones, you're going to create some differences that are all about that decision and not about the ownership structure, right? So interest rates, as I said, the town used 3.75 for the acquisition costs, the 30-year debt, and then 3.5. Aquarion currently averages 5.87. That drops down to, in 2022, for 1 year to 4.99. And then from 23 to 49, they use the town rate, the 3.5. So, they're just not going to get that financing, and I don't think it's going to hold to 2049 at that interest rate. So for the town, we used the 3.75 and the 3.5. The 3.5, which again is how they finance all the CapEx every year, we're increasing that to 25 basis points every 3 years. And then Aquarion is at 5.87. We kept that assumption. We then, after 2022, increase it. This 5.32 that you see is basically the typical spread between municipal rates and private company rate, or not private, they're public, but corporate rates effectively versus municipal rates. And we had that, we had their funding increasing every 5 years. So we assumed they would do a little bit more long-term financing. We actually thought it'd be more like 10, but they're buying capital every year, so the midpoint of a 10-year would have, on average, the increase would go up every 5 years. So that's how we got to that set of assumptions. So using that, what did it look like? I'm going to show you 2 years here in particular, 2020 and 2048. Now, the reason for those 2 years is 2019 in the model would be the year before the financing is fully in place. They use short-term financing where you only pay interest until they line up the bond. So that wasn't a good year to use. So we picked 2020 so we would have something that was a little cleaner. And then we used 2048 because the last year of the projection period is 2049, and the town finishes paying off the debt in 2048. So this really represents the view over the period where the town is paying off the cost of acquiring the water company, which is a big number. So that's what these two pictures look like. Operating costs for the town are $5.5 million in 2020 for Aquarion. It's 11.7. It's like, holy cow, right? How can there be that much difference? All right. So there's a couple of things going on. What's in that Aquarion number is the return they have to get on the profit they have to earn. That's one piece. Another piece that's in there is the treatment plant lease costs. So just as you're paying for, and I don't have any of the costs of buying the water company in that 5.4, but effectively the expense of that water treatment plant, it was over $40 million, I believe, right? That's the number. That you're paying back that number in that 11.6. So that's another piece that's in there. And then also the income tax is in there is another cost. So that's why you have such a big gap. And when you look out in 2048, you still maintain a pretty sizable gap for similar reasons. All those costs are baked into their operating costs. The debt service numbers aren't entirely comparable, but I put them in here just so you could see them. The $6 million being paid by the town, that includes paying back principal. The Aquarion debt service number is strictly interest. Again, when you look out to 2048, the town is paying principal. This is the last year that they pay the big principal on the acquisition, but they are paying principal on all that capital equipment or the capital investment that was made over the intervening years, what hasn't been paid off. Some of it was fully paid off some years, but there's still, pieces of 20 years of capital in there. And you can see Aquarion's interest costs in those outer years have grown as well under our model. The profit that they're earning is about 1.3 million of that. What was pulled out, it grows to about 2.6. Town doesn't have that. The CapEx expenditure under our assumptions are the town in 2020 will invest 2.7, so will Aquarion. That number will go to 3.7. Again, those are the same for both of them. Depreciation is something the town doesn't have, but it's an expense Aquarion has, and it's basically the way they get back their return of capital, right? Someone gives you money, you get interest, that's the return on, and you get back what you loan them, that's the return of. And so their depreciation is their return of their capital. And so the revenue requirement, the rate number, whatever you want to call it, for under town ownership in 2020 is 11.6 million versus Aquarion, which is about 12.9. It's about $1.2 million difference, savings under the town. And in 2048, it's 23.5 for the town, and 25.2, it's a savings, I think, of about 1.7. But remember that that 2048 year is the last year the town's paying for the acquisition. The next year, that number goes down by 6.2 million. All right, so let me, I'll show you what the savings is over the whole period. And these are some of the numbers that I think have been reported publicly that you might have seen. The town had done an analysis that said that the rates under town ownership would be $510 million over 30 years, and that Aquarions would be $647 million over that same period, so that under town ownership, there would be a savings of $137 million. Aquarion said, okay, the town's rates are $510. They didn't challenge those. But their rates were only going to be $470 million. But again, remember when I talked about their assumptions, they had that lower inflation rate. They assumed they could borrow at the town's rate. They didn't have any inflation on their capital expenditures. There were a whole bunch of things that kind of all together helped to keep rate increases down. And so they basically said that they were going to have it was going to be less expensive or more expensive under town ownership by $40 million. So when we ran it using those assumptions I just took you through, again, trying to normalize between the two for everything but ownership. And ownership matters, right? Because they have to get that return on capital, the debt financing is different, all those things. We had the town's actual cost being, or rates being more like $527 million. But we had Aquarions at $576 million. Again, using 3% inflation, using higher interest rates, all those items, for a savings to the town over 30 years of roughly $50 million. And again, this goes through 2049. Starting in this savings comes while you're paying back that huge debt obligation from buying the company. Starting in 2049, the last year of that forecast, the annual difference is $7.4 million. So that's this is what it looks like graphically. You know, you can see the step increases of rate increases every 3 years. Again, those rate increases are based on increasing costs given the 5% inflation rate and the capital investment that we talked about. The blue line is Aquarion. You see it drops dramatically in 2035. That's caused by two things, actually. When I corrected their depreciation numbers, their depreciation drops in 2035 when they finish depreciating the assets that are there today, basically. And you also stop paying the lease payments on the water treatment plant. So those two things actually cause their rates to go below the town's rates for a couple of years. And then they creep back up and exceed it again until the town pays off that debt service. If you look at the town's graph, it actually isn't a pure straight line. It's with the 3% inflation, it's close to that. But you see that in the beginning it jumps way up. That's because the first year they use short-term financing and they haven't started making those big payments. Then you start making the big purchase payments and that you stay at a high level till you get to 2048, and then you come down in 2049 once you've paid off buying the water company. And as I said, in that last year, you have that 7.4 million savings. So a couple of conclusions. and I'm repeating myself, but please bear with me. In order to compare these ownership options, I urge everyone to make sure you're looking at apples-to-apples comparison. It really is key. You have to have common assumptions aligned. You can't have two different inflation rates, for example. So in everything you hear, if you're going to pointedly ask questions, I would really make sure that that happens, that you're looking at it on a fair comparison basis. Due to differences in the interest rates, the need for equity returns, i.e. profit, the level of debt leverage, the town can borrow 100% at low borrowing rates. They don't have to pay anyone a 10.5% return on equity. The cost structure of the town, which is lower, there's just under $50 million in savings over the 30 years where you're paying off that big debt. And once the acquisition cost is paid off, the annual savings increase to $7.4 million per year. So that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Dondero. And thank you, Ms. Keim. At this time, I'd invite my colleagues on the board to pose any questions they feel appropriate.
Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Thank you both for for two very informative presentations. Julie, I just want to start and kind of go back to the MRAM because, you know, the water company financing, if that's like, you know, level 6, the MRAM to me is like level 32. It's very complex. So this is a surcharge that the DPU has authorized that Aquarion can charge for capital improvements. And as I was looking in here in the report, it may be here, but how much is that surcharge? How much is the surcharge that the DPU has approved for the next 5 years?
So your assessment was correct in the sense that it's been approved by the DPU. It's capped at 2% per year, change of 2% per year on the base revenues amount that's in the actual order. So it starts with the 13 million that we've talked about,
Okay.
reduced by, I'm getting there, reduced by these very specific charges that are listed in there. So it gets you to
That was
just
the
over 8 million, yep. And so annually, the surcharge could be capped at 2% of that.
So 2% of 8
Of the 8 million,
million.
so that's 174,000, I believe, if I could find my notes. But,
Okay.
Yeah,
So
and that's each year.
Each year.
If Aquarion expends on the eligible assets, they're very specific, so it is making the assumption that they will actually invest in those particular assets that are identified in the order. If they do, they can file for this additional surcharge, which would be up to a cap of 2%, which is the $174,000 per year, but it's compounding. You can have it each year. So in the first year, it's the 174 if they place in service the eligible assets and they're approved through the DPU order process. Then they can get another additional 174,000 the second year, and so on and so forth.
Okay, and in your experience with other utility companies and things, when a company puts an instrument like this in, is this a short-term instrument or is this a long-term instrument?
As I mentioned before, it's very subjective, but typically once a company gets the surcharge approved and they've gone through the process and they understand the process, typically in a subsequent rate case, they try to make the same, I wouldn't say argument, but the same position taking. But it has to be, it's very specific in this order. So I only caution you in looking at it being in the future, is that they're carved out and it's really to improve the infrastructure.
Right. And the reason I say that is that I think everybody in this room can also agree that the infrastructure, which is aging, is in need of significant repairs. So it would seem to me that the repairs that are needed to the water mains will take longer than 5 years to accomplish. Does, a final question about the MRAM, which is, given that the DPU puts restrictions on the amount of this surcharge, does that suggest in any way that rate increases with the DPU will happen sooner? In other words, you know, you hit, if you're the water company owner and you have this surcharge and you're bumping up against this cap a little sooner, do you have any experience with looking at other systems where that would compel the owner to ask for a rate increase sooner than they might ordinarily?
So yes, it would. If those investments are happening sooner rather than later, so I know right now there's kind of a projected timeline, but it's exactly what it is. It's projected if that increases because of need or company management decision or whatever it is, and those investments are put into place sooner, and they're still, again, it's still capped at this 2%, and they're expending a lot more than they had anticipated, that would drive a company, any company, to go in for rates sooner than waiting out this 5-year period, because the investment is so great that they're not getting a return, and I mean, they're in the business to you know, make a profit and make sure that they're also able to continue to run that business. So I would anticipate that they would go in for rates sooner.
Okay, thank you. And Jim, just to follow on that, and may I ask you to just go back to slide 13 in your presentation, which is kind of the summary of the numbers. Yep. So essentially right now, your conclusion of just under $50 million of savings under town ownership for 30 years, that excludes this MRAM surcharge.
That's correct.
Okay, so as Julie's talking about, for example, $175,000 over 5 years, that's, I don't know, it's about $1 million, I guess it's about $1 million. Would it be fair to say that the amount of any MRAM surcharge would be incremental, that would translate to additional savings beyond the $50 million?
So that is my understanding.
Okay.
Yes, so.
I view MRAM as sort of, it's a chance to earn a return before you have another rate increase, right, on what your incremental spend, put simplistically.
So it would, I guess my understanding would be that.
The savings would increase, yes.
So the savings in the town, so,
Yep.
and so if MRAM were to continue beyond, so right now we know in the rate case that MRAM has been approved for 5 years for a targeted amount, but to the extent that that continued beyond 5 years, that again would add additional savings to the $50 million that you've talked about.
Correct.
Okay. And Jim, just a question, if I could direct you. So in the first column, you've identified sort of the town savings, and you know that back in July, before the rate case was settled, so there were a number of variables that were in flux at that time. The potential savings were about $137 million, and today we're at about 50. Could you just kind of in summary form identify the major differences between sort of that column called town and that column called Anderson?
Sure. So on the town side, we have the difference between the 510 and our 526 is we have cost increase for the capital expenditures. We have higher capital expenditures. And we have increasing interest rates. So all three of those come
Increasing interest rates on the capital?
Yes, not on the acquisition-related financing, but on all the future annual capital expenditures, it increases 25 basis points
Okay.
every
Yep.
3
Thank you.
years.
Okay.
On the Aquarion model, I think the biggest difference is remember, that was, the town's Aquarion model was top-down, right? And so it assumes that straight 10% increase every year. And I think that it's the compounding of those increases that gets you to a number that's that much larger, because it's a 30-year period, right? And doing it bottom-up, looking at the costs, there's a little more nuance to it. So if you looked at my increases, some years they go up 10%. It's sort of probably roughly where it comes out, but there are early years where it's lower. And certainly with the treatment, when the treatment plant goes away, and because of my adjustment to depreciation, which directly impacts rate setting, right? Those things tended to give me a lower number on the Aquarion side.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Can I ask you to, I'm sorry, I'm the aging over here in the corner, but with the feedback, sometimes it's hard to
Yeah.
hear. So you listed sort of three points of difference between the town and the Anderson column. Could you just restate those?
For the town model?
Yeah.
Yes.
CapEx.
CapEx was the base CapEx, my assumption starting point. Then I had increased it every 5 years, every 3 years by 5%, right? That went up. And then their financing costs for that CapEx, I had that growing as well. And I think if you look at those items, those are the major causes. Just to be, I did not, what the town said their starting point was, I looked at and it seemed reasonable. And so I used the town's numbers. What Aquarion had from their rate case was my starting point. So I didn't mess with what both parties sort of said, here's where we start. It was only how it changed over time.
Okay. And on the MRAM, so that's going to be a surcharge cost, but then is there a depreciation cost that would attach once those assets are then placed in service?
To me? Yeah. So with the MRAM, so in the initial part of the surcharge, it's just the percentage is just capped. But then when you go in, when whoever company goes in for rates, then those eligible additions go into the rate base, and then that's when the depreciation starts kicking in. So it kicks in post next rate case.
So you pay the surcharge, but then it comes back into the rate case.
And that's why when it resets to zero, that's why they were specific in the order that they said that MRAM surcharge resets to zero. They're very specific about that in the next rate case, so that you weren't getting, still getting some kind of surcharge on that and getting the return. Yeah.
Right.
So what it will do is, when those eligible additions go into the rate base in the subsequent rate case, they'll be lower because they will have depreciated during the period of time that the surcharge was going.
Yep.
So it's a very complex piece, and so I'm trying to simplify it, but not gloss it over. So yeah, so that depreciation that goes on during the surcharge period, that's not built into the rates because it's offline.
Gotcha.
But then when it resets to zero, that net depreciated amount goes in, and then that's part of the base rates.
Okay. And I know, Jim, you didn't include MRAM in your calculations, just to, again, compare apples to apples with the numbers that we've seen, but I think part of the reason I'm asking about it anyway is my recollection was the footnotes in the in the presentation to the DPU indicate that Aquarion didn't believe they could complete these capital improvements without the surcharge, and that's, to your point, the necessity of the capital surcharge for the health and viability of Aquarion to undertake what it needs to undertake for infrastructure improvement depend on that surcharge amount.
Right.
Right, otherwise, I would assume DPU would say, go pound sand. You're
Right,
not-
if they can't recover that in some way, then they can't afford, as a company, they can't afford to invest in it. That's the position.
I had some particular questions earlier on that I think between you and Jim, you've probably covered, but, I was getting a little confused in the beginning about the timing difference between a 3-year time period for a rate increase and a 5-year time period for a rate increase, and, is that just a sort of a time value of money issue, or, I guess, what is the effect of that frequency metric in kind of our understanding of how the rates would fall out?
Did you look at the difference in?
So
periods?
what I can tell you is the actual cost increase, I believe, and again, it doesn't tie to that number because it's before other adjustments, but I want to say it was close to 600 million, this is coming from memory, so that basically by delaying it, only having the increase every 3 years is a bit of a lag of recovery.
Yeah.
And I think that was, the impact of that was about 20 million over 3 years. But that's actually exactly what the MRAM, I think, is intended to try to assist with,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Isn't that to kind of help
Right.
give you some incremental revenue
Right.
before
In
you
between-
can boost the
In between
rates?
rate increases.
Right. It doesn't help you recover increases in your costs,
Right,
but it does get you something on your capital expenditure.
right, okay. I think that's it for me for now. Thank you, it was very informative, and, I think presented well, and obviously we'll have this material available on the website, right, for folks to pull down. Okay, great.
I just have a quick question. Is that 2% increase, in your experience, have you seen a bigger percentage allowed by the DPU?
So no, I haven't seen in Massachusetts specifically, but we did look at, and I apologize, I can't remember which one, if it was New Hampshire or Connecticut now, but I know that in one of Aquarion's other water companies in one of the other 2 states was a higher percentage than 2%. It may have even been uncapped. I can't quite recall right now, but I do remember having a conversation with John Robertson, one of my team members, and commenting on that. But I can get that information to you. But I do recall it being higher. The allowable amounts were higher outside of.
When you say uncapped, what do you mean by that?
Well, right now in Massachusetts, per the order, they've capped the 2% surcharge. So Aquarion, no matter how much they put in, no matter what they do at this point, they cannot charge customers more than 2% of the base revenues that's defined in the order. Whereas in the other state, it was either a higher percentage of that revenue, or it may have even been allowable to the full amount that they actually placed in service. So it can be different by state, and I don't have a specific example to compare it to in Massachusetts, only to, I think it was Connecticut, but I can verify that and let you know tomorrow.
Thank you. Gentleman to my left, any questions at this time?
First of all, let me say thank you. That was, I learned some things, so that was very helpful. Julie, in terms of your research you mentioned earlier that there were MRAM-like mechanisms in Connecticut and New Hampshire. Do you have any information about how long they've been in place in those states?
No, it relates to the same kind of question I was just talking with Paul about, or answering with him. That was John Robertson, my team member. He did a lot of that detailed. I do have that information back at home, and I'm happy to provide that to you tomorrow when we're back in the office. I know it's been going on. One of the things I can remember is it's gone through a rate case and is still being charged or calculated and charged. So I know it's lived through at least one rate case and moved on. So, but I can get the more specific detail to you.
Great, thank you.
No, I don't have any questions.
I agree that very helpful. I really appreciate it, and long awaited. On the MRAM, to the extent we were to somehow factor in that in our thought process, would we have to be adding some capital costs to our costs? Right, this is supposed to be some kind of extraordinary capital, not just regular capital improvement. Is that kind of additional capital improvement already factored into what we think we would be paying annually in capital expenditures?
So, you would have to determine how you would pay for that as a town, the additional infrastructure costs. I don't know if you thought
I guess
through...
because it seems like it's a little gap between the two of you.
Yeah.
But I'm just trying to understand. I mean, I wouldn't think you'd be able to answer that question.
So, my understanding of the MRM is it's not the argument they make is how much incrementally they have to spend, right? But it's certain specific types of capital improvements, I believe, right?
Yes.
Well, for
Yep.
example, water main replacement.
Right.
And all the, if you're replacing the water main and you have valves that need replacing and things like that, those are all qualify to go into MRAM. So,
And is that kind of work already reasonably anticipated in the capital expenditures that you looked at for the town modeling?
well, I remember my starting point was what Aquarion said they were going to spend through 2022.
And you
I
used that
just-
for the town?
And I used it for the town as well. I just smoothed it.
Right.
Averaged
So it sounds
it.
like the answer is yes.
The answer is, yeah, I wasn't sure of the question, so that's why I couldn't give you a
enough.
shorter
I wasn't sure of the
answer. But
question
yes,
either.
the answer is yes.
Okay.
Same.
You had, I think, said, sorry, this is just going to be kind of hodgepodge, but you had said that the 75% approval assumption you were uncomfortable with. Remember that assumption that only 75% of the case rate of the requests would be approved?
Yep.
Did you make some adjustment for that, or how did you deal with that?
I assumed that basically they would get 99% of it, which was what they got in the most recent case of that.
Did you look at any kind of historical information on that, besides just the last rate case, or I'm just wondering?
No, I just looked at the last rate case.
Okay. All right. So, the big delta here, obviously, is, if we're looking at slide 13, yeah, we still have that up there.
Yep,
Is
yep.
obviously the Aquarion costs where you are, almost 100 million, on both sides of it, essentially, right? So, just so I'm clear, is in disagreeing with Aquarion, right, and getting to 576 rather than 470.
Yep.
Is it basically the accumulation of the observations that you made basically on pages 8 and 9? Maybe can we flip to those?
Yeah, that would be correct, yes.
Okay. And were some of these bigger ticket items than others? I mean, are there some real major ones here?
Well, I mean, it might not seem like 80 basis points on inflation might not sound like a lot, but over 30 years, it compounds to a pretty major impact. So that clearly was one. That not having a inflation adjustment for CapEx, that was a big one. Assuming they could use the town's financing rate. That was another pretty material one. So those, I think, were probably the big three.
So, and I don't know, maybe this is not a coherent question, but, the town's approach, when they were trying to figure it out, as you said, was top-down, right?
Yep.
And basically came to 3.2% increase every year for Aquarion's rate increases. You did it, it sounds like you did it bottom-up, kind of similar to their model, but made adjustments to the numbers based on those pages that we just went over, albeit briefly. So did that come out to a particular percentage? Like if the town was assuming 3.2 in its modeling, what percentage did yours come out to ultimately?
Oh, the rate, I don't have that calculation off the top of my head.
Okay, because it just wasn't the way that you looked at it.
Well, yeah, because it went up, for example, that 20,
Yeah, the chart.
that, if you look at that graph,
Right.
that 2034 to 2035, the rates go down by 15.6%. So there's a big drop that impacts the overall increases. But those steps that you see are generally roughly in a 10% range, which is something you could expect since we're using a 3% annual inflation rate, right? So, and a lot of the costs are indexed to that.
Okay, and now, at the end of the day, like, you obviously had to make some assumptions, right? This is an imperfect science here that we're doing.
Yep.
I mean, would you characterize the assumptions that you made as conservative, middle of the road, or how would you characterize it?
Well, so it's an interesting question is how you define conservative, right? Because I would tell you what I was most concerned with was trying to make them as comparable as possible. And so when I assumed, so what are sort of different assumptions I made? One is the town has assumed that they're going to go out and borrow money every year, and so I assumed that would go up 25 basis points every 3 years. I assumed Aquarion would probably be looking at longer-term financing. So I assumed that probably they would use a 10-year debt financing, but I assumed I would have an increase every 5 years, which to me is the midpoint of a 10-year period, because there's always some new capital they have to go out and finance somehow. Now, that's an assumption I made, and that's an assumption that's different between the two models. If I wanted to increase the Aquarion model, as much as I could, I would assume that the interest rate went up consistent with what the town did every 3 years. So I was giving it, I was recognizing they have a little bit longer, a little better ability perhaps to maintain their financing. I will tell you, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but it was a little tricky with the financing because their model, and I tried to stay true to using their model as much as I could. Their model basically assumes a debt-to-equity ratio in the first year, and it's roughly 53 equity to 47 debt. And they keep that constant throughout the model. So I couldn't say, we're going to finance this acquisition with a certain amount, like the town, you're going to go out and you're going to raise a bond to pay for the whole thing. Well, every year I want it to be consistent. I used their assumption of 53-47, so that I didn't finance a specific period. I just looked at the total, the net assets that were out there, and because that's the rate base, and assumed 47% of it was funded with debt and 53% of it was funded with equity. Okay. And I'm sorry I didn't put that assumption in there because it was, it just sort of was consistent through their whole model, and I didn't change it, but perhaps I should have put that in there. But
And why did you, on that debt service topic, did you have interest only for debt service for Aquarion?
Oh, because that's what they show. They only in their rate filings, they basically get these are all our costs of running the water company. And then they have a cost of debt, which is only the interest.
Okay.
And then they have a cost of equity, a return on the equity. And really, if you think about it, their depreciation number, that's an expense to the ratepayers. You pay them that. That's not a cash outflow for them, but that's money they need to pay the debt service, and that's cash they use to sort of fund, repay principal on debt and things like that. That's a return of the investment they made.
Okay. All right. And then, as you say, after the 30 years is gone, we're seeing $7.5 million a year
Yep.
thereafter. Okay. All right, thank you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Jim, I've got one question, just a sec. The chart that, 14, could you just bring that back up for a sec? Might be worth explaining the dip in 2035, just what triggers that in terms of the Aquarion cost.
So there's two components of that. The largest one is the lease costs for the water treatment plant are, I believe they're north of $4 million, and they're in that number. And those, once that treatment plant is all paid off, the agreement between, because that's not technically in the same entity, that's in a separate special purpose entity. The lease payments drop to about $500,000. So that's the big part of that drop. The additional piece is, when I looked at the way they did their depreciation, and I found what I believe is a flaw in the way they did it, that correction kind of ends. I used the same number they had through 2034, and then my number is actually lower than theirs for depreciation beyond that, because I think they kept depreciating an asset that already would have been at zero, basically, is what was going on. So I fixed that, and that's what drops those rates down, as you see there.
Thank you.
Yep.
Jim, if I could ask you a question on chart 13, to the $49 million, roughly $50 million worth of savings. Is it fair to ask you, could you characterize that as, is it best case or worst case?
Well, on the one hand, on the other hand, I think that's, I would make one thing I know for sure. It's probably the low, since it doesn't have MRAM, right? And if you have MRAM's going to increase that number. Otherwise, I think it's fairly fair representation. You know, to the extent interest rates go up or go down, there's still going to be a spread between municipal rates and corporate rates. That's not going to go away. You know, inflation goes up, it's going to hit both of you. So all those things are consistent. And the 10.5% cost of equity, you know, it's a pretty stable number, that particularly for utility. It's a little high for utility, but this is a small utility. So I think it's totally reasonable, but it's pretty stable. So I don't see that changing dramatically. But worst case scenario, you think, what's worst case? Oh God, you know, we have to replace twice as many mains because of breaks. Well, guess what? You got to do that under both models. So exactly how much it impacts the savings, I don't know. I can't say.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Could I ask one other question? Jim, if I go back to slide 14 in that graph in the water treatment plant lease, and I'll apologize in advance if this is a question you can't answer, but my recollection is that when the lease on the water treatment plant expires, there's some sort of a balloon payment that is due. And I guess as I'm thinking about that, I'm wondering if that's...
So my understanding is the financing of it has a balloon payment.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's Aquarion Water Capital.
Okay.
It's not the lease on the water treatment plant, it's the refinancing expiration, the bullet payment that's due in 2022 of $12.7 million.
Okay.
That's,
At the expiration of the lease, if my memory serves me correctly, the rent charge becomes 30% of the fixed charge that was in effect in 2035, the year before the lease expires.
Okay.
And that's about $500,000.
Thank you.
So you go from about $4 million to $500,000.
Thank you.
At this point, I'd invite the advisory Subcommittee, to the extent they have any questions at this time, welcome you. Ms. Claypool?
Libby Claypool with Advisory and the subcommittee. Jim, I think this is for you in this packet. You mentioned that you did not see a material difference in the prevailing wage between the municipal and corporate rates, so you didn't, the models had the same amount.
Correct.
But the municipality will have retirement and other post-employment benefits. So is that something that, as a if the water company is town-owned, the town will have the obligation to pay retirement and OPEB and things that a corporate entity doesn't pay? So I don't know if it's more for John, for whoever did the model. I mean, because that's kind of a big difference, and I'm wondering if those two components are incorporated in the town model,
So
in the expense structure.
John, can I just take one? I did think about that, but I would like to hear John's response. I did think about it, and you have to remember the repairs where the prevailing comes in. You have to pay a prevailing wage. They don't get municipal benefits, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those aren't town employees.
Mm-hmm.
So the people doing the digging and the pipe replacement generally aren't going to be town employees.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be a private company who manages the operation generally, so those aren't town employees. So you're talking about a very small number of people. And frankly, with a 3% inflation rate, by 2049, the salaries in that bucket are quite large, and I would be quite surprised if there was a municipal employee, the number of people who would be here who would utilize that much. So I think there's some cushion in that number, those are my comments on the question.
But the inflation piece would really just be dealing with the salary piece, not the retirement OPEB piece.
It's really,
Yes.
it's really
Yeah.
both. I mean, Jim said it exactly right relative to the outsourcing operations and maintenance vendor. Those aren't town employees. The model contemplates a full-time water and superintendent and administrative support. Those costs we pass by the town accountant, and they are fully burdened. So they would accommodate the costs that you've just cited.
So you're saying that 2 full-time people is what your town
It may
employs?
be part-time on the admin side. It's definitely a full-time water superintendent.
Okay, I think that's it.
Thank you. Anybody else from the committee like to pose a question before we take it to the general public? Okay. General public time. Again, I would just ask that you raise your hand to be recognized, come to the mic, address your questions to me, and I'll try and figure out who is best to answer them. Yes, Ms. Rowe.
Thank you. Pauline Rowe, longtime former Hingham resident, current Hull resident, Rockview Road. 2 questions, one of which is very easy, and I think Ms. Johnson might have referenced it. For those of us sitting here in the audience or people watching on TV that would like to review the 2 handouts that you have to either be able to read them or understand them, how can we get a handout? How can we access this information?
It'll be posted to the town's website tomorrow morning, first thing.
The Town of Hingham's website?
Hingham's
Because
website.
it's Holland Coast.
I'll distribute it as well to Mr. Lemnios and Mr. Senior.
Okay.
In both Hull and Cohasset.
Okay, thank you. And the second question, I forget which one of our professionals was describing a scenario about capital improvement projects, and perhaps going beyond what they had anticipated for that year, spending amount, the need, and so forth, and that would necessitate a jumping into another rate increase. I'd like to ask whomever the appropriate person is, under the proposed town ownership, because that same scenario could happen, and I'm thinking of what went on in Situate within the last couple of years, and then they had a really sharp rate increase. What would be who would be deciding a rate increase if you had all these capital improvements that needed to be made faster than you expected? Who decides that? Who decides the rate increase? And what protections are there for the ratepayers? Like now you have the DPU and things have to go through a process and be approved. Under town ownership, what are the protections for ratepayers, please?
Okay, who would like to take that? I think it is governance.
So Ms. Rowe, available on the town website was a governance presentation I did probably, I don't know, a month, 6 weeks ago, something like that. And one of the slides outlined the rate consideration process that would be undertaken by the town. So as John said, what we contemplate doing is hiring a full-time water superintendent who would be a town employee. The governance model includes a citizens or ratepayer advisory board that would work with the superintendent to run through a budget process, much like, as the advisory committee knows, much like we're going through now with every other department of the town. I think one of the built-in protections of the process is, as Mr. Dondero mentioned, town meeting would be asked to adopt this as an enterprise fund, and so there's a statutory overlay when you drop an operating enterprise into the enterprise fund. Massachusetts law dictates how you how you evaluate the expenses of the enterprise, and those are that's the rate that can be charged. So, it's I think a combination, to answer your question more directly, it's a combination of state law, but then our typical budget process, which would include hearings before the advisory committee as well as the Board of Selectmen to set rates.
I would just like to remind everyone here that this isn't going to be the last hearing or meeting we have on the subject, and in fact, we contemplate the Water Study Committee here, Acquisition Study Committee, to be having some follow-on meetings where the totality of the issue can be delved into in greater detail. We're speaking to the financial model here tonight, so on that basis, Mr. O'Hare, I see you had your hand up. Do you still wish to be recognized?
Thank you.
Okay.
Can I?
Sure, John.
Just to follow up on what Paul just said, I've already posted for the Water Company Acquisition Study Committee for this coming Tuesday, the 15th. We'll probably be meeting here. We will discuss financial analysis, and on the next night, Wednesday, we will discuss governance. The following week, we will address the third of the three phases, which would be engineering. Right now, I think that will be Wednesday, the 23rd. A lot of people want to use the room, so it's a little bit of a juggling act, but just for folks that, to follow up on Paul's point, want to think about this, look at the material that'll be posted on the website by tomorrow, and then come back and discuss it further. There'll be opportunities with our committee.
I'm going to wait till everybody who's wanted to ask a question has the opportunity before I circle back.
Paul, do you mind if I just piggyback on what John just said? I just wanted to let everyone know that John's meetings, the Water Company Acquisition Study Committee meetings, will all be televised. Tuesday, we can only televise one meeting at a time. Tuesday will be, the Board of Selectmen will likely be looking at some perennial articles, Hannah Lincoln Whiting articles and the like. I think everyone wants to see their discussion far more than ours, so they will be on TV on Tuesday, not us. And no offense to those who care deeply about that article, but it's, anyway, the point is they're having a more substantive conversation, so they'll be on TV on Tuesday, not the Board of Selectmen.
Chair recognizes Laura Burns.
Laura Burns, 96 Hersey Street. The part that I am the most confused about the financial model, and I think probably I'm not the only one, is the cost of the water treatment plant financing and how that figures into each of the different models. Aquarion pays a lease payment, as I'm going to, tell me if I'm right about this, tell me if I got this right. Aquarion pays a lease payment for the use of the water treatment plant to a separate legal entity, which I understand also to be owned by Aquarion's parent company, is that right? Yes. So they pay the lease payment, and that separate entity bears the financing cost for the building of the water treatment plant. The town, of course, wouldn't need to go that route. We would, the cost of paying for the water treatment plant will be subsumed in the financing for the whole project. It all goes together. Right. So I know that when the town did its top-down analysis, it took out of its costs the lease payment for the water treatment plant to the external entity as one of the costs it would not have to bear. And I just wanted to make sure that Anderson's model for the town, or your adjustment to the town's, your version of the town's model operates that way, or do I have that wrong?
No, you have it absolutely correct. And remember, my starting point for the town was what the town had done, which I agreed, I looked at and didn't see any errors in.
That made sense. Okay.
Right, and likewise for Aquarion. And, you know, your description of it is spot on. And, you know, so the financing that's kind of going on is outside of it, and those very high costs of paying that lease payment for the treatment plant is all baked into the acquisition cost, which will be part of your 40-year debt service.
Okay, thank you.
Does that help?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Salisbury.
I would like to...
Could you identify yourself by name and address, please,
yes,
ma'am?
Catherine Salisbury, 10 Ridgewood Crossing.
Good evening.
I would be interested in knowing, we've had a great deal about the rates and the future of rates, about the tax rate. The Hingham ratepayers are also the taxpayers. General obligation bonds are being proposed to pay for this acquisition. And so the residents of Hull and Cohasset will not have that liability of that tax rate going up, but I'd like to see a study of how it's going to affect my tax rate for, maybe not individually, but, you know, me, the average taxpayer in Hingham, how it's going to affect our tax rates for the next 29 years or 30 years.
Sure.
Thank you.
Paul, I could take that if you want.
Sure, Tom.
Sure. So, Ms. Salisbury, we've consulted with our financial advisors and general counsel and bond counsel along the way. And what they've advised us is that a revenue bond would require special legislation. So we would be using a general obligation bond, as you stated.
Right.
However, we've also been advised along the way that because of the special nature as a utility purchase for this bond issuance, we would be it would, in essence, be protected. The town's debt capacity would, in essence, be isolated from this debt because of the utility nature of the purchase.
But we'd still have, it would be reflected in our tax rates, in our property taxes.
No, this is 100% covered by ratepayers. All of these expenses
Even though it's
are
a
covered
general
by,
obligation
even though
bond.
it's a general obligation
Okay.
bond. That's right.
Okay.
Good question. Thank you.
Good to know.
No, yep, yep.
So,
Jim,
Tom,
do you want to go back to slide 5, I think, in yours?
sorry, could I
and
just ask the question on what Tom was just saying? So you're saying that it should not affect our rating?
We're advised right now that we've had several, our financial advisors have been speaking with the rating agencies for several years, advising them that this might be coming, and it could be, you know, so there's no surprises there to the rating agencies. We've had some preliminary conversations with them as things get close, that, you know, what if this happens, what if that happens, and the preliminary feedback we've been getting from the rating agencies is positive, that it would not affect our rating.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I would just add to that as we've been talking to the rating agencies, they are also aware that the town as a municipality is contemplating several large capital purchases in the future, because that is also something that's happening with the town. So they are aware of Foster School, the needs with fire stations, the potential for the library project, and understand that some of those projects could come to fruition over the next 10 years.
And for those of you who are interested in following up on the report from the financial advisors, that's also on the website. We met with them when we met in the school committee room, again, probably, what, couple?
August.
August, okay.
All right.
So that information is also available to you on the website.
Anyone else? I'm going to recognize the residents first, Mr. Walsh. Yes, Ms. Claypool.
Oh, my God.
Second bite.
Okay.
Let's have it.
Different apple.
Tastes the same.
So I guess two things. John, I would just ask if possible, those meetings with the Water Company Study Acquisition Committee could not conflict with AdCom meetings, because, for example, next Tuesday night, we can't come on a Tuesday night because we meet. So a Wednesday night's fine. And so I would just say that for the subcommittee, in order for us to be involved, we would not be able to come on a Tuesday night. So I would just make that request. And then, I'm not sure who, I don't know if, Karen, you were talking about the enterprise fund. So one question that I had is for, while I understand the ratepayers under the general obligation bond will pay for it, but it's sort of a double-barreled bond from the standpoint that it's the ratepayers, but then also because it is a general obligation bond and would be backed by the full faith and credit of the town, there is still that backstop that if ratepayers and the rates weren't sufficient, there would still be some potential. I mean, how big, maybe it's not a big exposure, but that real estate rates could be increased if there was a gap and it wasn't, the costs weren't fully recouped by ratepayers. So I'm just saying, I think that's something that, as a general obligation bond, that full faith and credit of the town is backing that up, and that's, you know,
So again,
a slight possibility if there's a gap.
So again, in our conversations with our financial advisors as well as the credit rating
Yeah.
agencies, they have told us that they don't see that as a risk to the rating
Right.
preliminarily.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the rating, though, I'm talking about to the potential real estate rates within Hingham. So, I mean, I understand all the costs are being
so if the-
assumed
if
by
the-
the ratepayers. I'm just saying, if there ever is a gap, because it is a general obligation bond, that exposure is there. And so again, maybe it's a small exposure, but it's still,
So I think
it's still there.
the governance structure, as we've been discussing it, to date, has suggested that the Board of Selectmen would act as the water commissioners
Mm-hmm.
and would have the ability to increase rates if needed in that unlikely scenario.
Right.
So to cover those rates. So again,
Right.
it wouldn't hit the taxpayers.
Right.
And in this case, you have the executive body of the town to protect that.
Okay, and since in this case, the town, if the town purchased it, then it would be, you're saying, because it's general obligation bond, not a revenue bond that would then have some other entity incorporated, then it's with the enterprise fund, is the expectation that the money then that all comes from the ratepayers is going to go back into the water system, so it's all going to stay? Is that a requirement, that all the money that comes in stays within?
Absolutely.
So it can't go to other departments within the town?
And again, remember that, you know, as we all know, and I think we can all agree, we have an aging infrastructure. We have 190 miles worth of water mains throughout the service area that need replacement. I think regardless of how this ownership issue turns out, we're going to be replacing water mains for a very long time in these communities, or we should be, to be taking proper care of these assets. So there are more capital needs in the water system that we have to address over a long period of time.
Yes, sir.
Joshua Ross, 125 Wampatuck Road. This may be a finance question, it may not be, but given the fact that you guys were just discussing structure, is there any legal liability that the town would incur in case of, worst case scenario, think of any sort of things happen with municipal water companies like Flint, Michigan, or something like that, where something major happens, would the town be on the hook for legal liabilities, or would that still be encompassed in like a water company? I'm just trying to think of, I don't know if that's the discussion now with finance, or if it's something down the road, but looking long-term, if anything were to happen, who's on the hook?
I suppose it depends on what happens, but perhaps Mr.
Well,
Mayor can...
the one quick answer I would have is, no matter who owns it, the ratepayers are on the hook.
Okay, that's what it's
Exactly what I like that. That's exactly what I was just going to say.
Thank you, Mr. Dondero.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
So legal fees, any sort of that, it all goes back to the
Well,
ratepayers.
to Paul's point, I mean, the devil's in the details. We're hiring a professional water operating company. We will insist on certain capitalization of that company in order to be the successful bidder to operate the system. So, you know, the first sort of line of liability, my suggestion would be to this water operator. So, you know, I think there is, built into this model, there's a bit of a buffer between the actual operation of the company and the town itself.
Okay.
So, no, yeah, it's a good question.
Yes, Ms. Buer? Name and address, please.
Megan Buer, 489 Main Street. I just have a simple question. How long would the contract be for whoever we hire to manage?
That's more in the governance aspect of things, and we're trying to stay on the financial track, but that'll be covered in great detail by the Water Acquisition Study Committee.
Okay.
Invite you to attend.
I do have some concerns about like long-term contracts, so that's just something I'd like to keep in mind. Thank you.
Bring it up to them. Thank you so much. Mr. Walsh. Greetings.
Thank you. John Walsh, Vice President of Operations for Aquarion. So I was glad to hear tonight the importance of an apples-to-apples comparison, so thank you for that. So in reference to that, regarding MRAM, I've heard some back and forth regarding MRAM. So just understand that MRAM is not just a surcharge. What is behind MRAM is additional capital spending. So if you were to add MRAM under Aquarion ownership, you would have to add that same imputed capital expenditure under the town model. So we would be glad to give you guidance and your advisors further guidance on that if that's needed. It doesn't, the indication or the suggestion that it simply adds to the 50 million savings means that you're not considering that that same amount of additional capital spending would have to be added in the model under the town's ownership. And then second item is there's been discussion of a contract operator. So in your own model,
we are sticking with a particular agenda item tonight, Mr. Walsh, but we'd certainly welcome your attendance at the Water Acquisition Study Committee meeting.
So this relates to the financial.
Keep it tight. We just don't want to go
So this
astray
relates
the
to the
agenda.
financial. 40% in your model from July, 40% of the cost that will be going to a contract operator. So we know in September, I believe it was in September, there was a statement on the town website indicating that your non-binding estimates, your two non-binding estimates from contract operators would be provided. That was in September, I believe. And I'm wondering if those could be posted tomorrow, and along with it, if you could make public the contract or the scope and terms that were used to obtain those non-binding estimates.
Oh, Paul, I can take that if you want me to.
No. Thank you so much, Mr. Walsh.
Thank you.
Can I just react to that for a little bit? Because I'm a little...
Wait a minute, can I respond to the MRAM comment?
Yeah,
Certainly.
I think the capital is the capital that's in there. Whether it qualifies for MRAM or not, I don't know. But I think if you added the same capital to both models, you would still see a further increase from those MRAM charges that would increase the savings. We're not suggesting that Aquarion would make investments subject to MRAM, and those same investments would not be made on the town model. We are assuming they would be there.
Just further to that, and this is what I asked about earlier, you used their capital plan.
We did use their capital plan.
Which presumably formed the basis for the MRAM request.
Correct. I assume that that plan that they presented on August 13th of last year certainly had main replacement, which I think is one of the items that qualifies for MRAM.
Right.
I don't know the particulars of what goes in the MRAM, but
that cost is what you imputed to the town model?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, it's 10 after 9. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. Citizens of the town, I hope you tune in and watch this. At this point, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved?
Second. All those in favor? Aye. Good night, everyone.